So, I'm doing my presentation on Oscar Wilde. I will talk more in depth about his life in general, his most famous works, and also his imprisonment for being gay in England in the 19th century. Oscar Wilde was a very eccentric, kind of out there character, so I wanted to include this quote that kind of describes him as a person. He says, "I am so clever that I sometimes don't understand a single word of what I'm saying." So this kind of encompasses his attitude and just the kind of person that he was. He was kind of full of himself, but also just a fun, charismatic character to be around as well. So to start off, we're going to talk about his early life. He was born on October 16th, 1854 in Dublin, Ireland. His mother was Jane Francesca Elgie, and she was a published writer of mostly poetry. She was also closely associated with the Young Irelander Rebellion of 1848. His father was a knighted doctor who was very intelligent and successful. His name was William Wilde, and he opened up his own hospital completely at his own expense to treat the poor. So his father was a very caring person, but it also shows that his family was pretty wealthy. I would say it makes sense that he grows up to be kind of a rebel because of his mother's associations with the same kind of things. Education-wise, Wilde had always been a smart child, and he was allowed to go to his parents' parties that they would throw, which was very rare at the time. He probably benefited from being allowed to be at these parties because he got to talk to these intelligent members of society, which was something that kids his age were not doing. He attends the Portora Royal School, and there he falls in love with Greek and Roman studies, also known as classics. He then receives a scholarship to attend Trinity College in Dublin, and he really shows his success there. At the end of his first year at Trinity, he places first in the school's classics exams and also receives the college's foundation scholarship, which is the highest honor awarded to undergraduates. He also receives the Berkeley Gold Medal as Trinity's best student in Greek and the Demyship Scholarship for further study at Magdalen College in Oxford. So his creative writing career begins at Oxford, and the year of his graduation, he writes Ravenna, which wins the Newdigate Prize for Best English Verse Composition by an Oxford undergraduate, and we can see his career really starting to bloom. So Oscar continues this success, and his career starts off when he moves to London and moves in with Frank Miles, who was a popular portraitist at the time. He publishes a collection of poems titled Poems in 1881, and he gets modest praise for these, but it does jumpstart his career as a writer and gets his name out there. So then he decides to go on an American lecture tour where he travels to New York City and delivers 140 lectures in 9 months, which is pretty impressive. There he meets with leading American scholars, Henry Longfellow, Oliver Wendell Holmes, and Walt Whitman, who he especially admired and loved. And there are some letters out there that he wrote to him about just how much he looked up to him. Then he goes back to London and decides to do another lecture tour in Ireland as well as in England. So here he begins to assert himself as a leader of the aesthetic movement, which is a movement in art and literature that values beauty over a political or social statement. Then on May 29th, 1884, he gets married to Constance Lloyd, who is a wealthy woman, and they have 2 sons, Cecil and Vivian. He gets hired to run Ladies' World, which is at the time a sinking English magazine. He really freshens up the magazine and makes it about women's feelings and thoughts instead of just fashion. So a quote from him is, deal not merely with what women wear, but what they think and what they feel. So it's said that he wanted men and women to be able to enjoy the magazine, but the magazine really did focus on women empowerment, which was a very new idea at the time. And I think it's interesting that as a man, he supported these values and kind of tried to make them popular and give women a little bit more credit. So after Oscar's collection of poems titled Poems, he decides to write a collection of children's stories titled The Happy Prince and Other Tales. Then he goes on to write Intentions in 1891, which is an essay collection arguing the tenets of aestheticism, the movement that he felt so strongly about. He then goes on to write The Picture of Dorian Gray in 1891, which is his only novel we know of, and it is a cautionary tale of a beautiful young man who wishes that his portrait would age while he stays young. Critics were very harsh and angry about this novel. The characters lacked morality, and it was kind of inappropriate for the time, talking about risky subject matter. But Wilde goes to defend his style and says that that's what aestheticism is about, and he stands by what he wrote. So then he goes and writes Lady Windermere's Fan in 1891 also, which is his first play, and it gains immense popularity, which is when he decides to adopt playwriting as his primary literary form. So he decides that he's going to stick to plays from now on. He writes a few more witty and satirical comedies, but they do have their underlying dark subjects and tones. These include A Woman of No Importance, An Ideal Husband, and The Importance of Being Earnest. Now I will be discussing The Importance of Being Earnest in a little bit more depth. So it is a play in 3 acts. It was first performed in 1895 and it was officially published in 1899. So the main character is a wealthy man named Jack who lives in the country with his ward, Cicely. He invents a fake brother named Ernest, which gives him an excuse to travel to London periodically when he tells people that he is rescuing Ernest, but really he's just going there to have fun for himself. He is in love with a woman named Gwendolen, who is the cousin of his best friend, Algernon. So Gwendolen thinks that Jack's real name is Ernest, and she decides that she will love him back. But her mother, Lady Bracknell, objects because she says that Jack is an orphan who was found in a handbag at a train station. So Jack discovers that Algernon has been impersonating Ernest as well to woo Cicely, who has always been in love with the imaginary Ernest that Jack tells her about. Eventually it is revealed that Jack is actually Lady Bracknell's nephew. His real birth name is Ernest, and Algernon is actually his brother. So both couples end up happily married in the end by just some crazy coincidence. And yes, they do marry their cousins, if you call it that, but that's not important. So I think this piece is really commenting on the upper class and kind of making fun of them and their behaviors, their values, the way they act, the parties that they throw, and the relationships that they have with one another. I've mentioned aestheticism a few times, so now I will define it and talk about how Wilde was a member of the movement. So aestheticism is defined as late 19th century European art movement, which centered on the doctrine that art exists for the sake of its beauty alone, and that it need serve no political, social, or other purpose. So this is the idea that art should be beautiful, and that should be the only reason it exists. So this movement began in reaction to the utilitarian social philosophies and the perceived ugliness of the industrial age. So people wanted to focus on beauty and thought that art was the best way to do that. So these foundations were laid by Immanuel Kant, who said that aesthetic standards were completely separate from considerations of morality, utility, or pleasure. So to touch on Wilde's personal life, he does lead a secret life. At the time, homosexuality was considered a crime, and Oscar Wilde had many friendships with gay men. He eventually did take part in affairs with some of them as well. So he is what we would now call a closeted homosexual. He was not very discreet about his affairs, and there were many rumors going around, but people loved his works, and he was very charismatic and liked, so no one really had the motives to destroy his life by acting on any of these assumptions. His affairs with men became frequent, and he met Lord Alfred Douglas, who was an English poet and aristocrat who was also 16 years younger than him. So Douglas's father is outraged by his son's gay relationship and leaves a calling card for Wilde that reads, "For Oscar Wilde, posing sodomite." He spells sodomite wrong, which for some reason really aggravates Wilde, as well as the fact that he was being accused of being a gay man. His homosexuality at that point was somewhat known, but was still a secret, and if it was out, it would be a crime, so Wilde decides to sue him for libel. As I'm sure you can tell by the title of this slide, this was a terrible decision for Wilde, because he was suing a man for lying about him, but in fact, the claim was true. So evidence of Wilde's homosexuality was not hard to find. There were many homoerotic passages of his writing, and also love letters to Douglas, which ended up getting Wilde arrested on cases of gross indecency. So Wilde was convicted on May 25th, 1895, and then sentenced to 2 years of prison, which was the maximum sentence at the time for the crime of being gay. Wilde's health quickly deteriorated in prison and during the time after it. He spent the last 3 years of his life as an exile in France, sleeping in cheap hotels and crashing with friends that lived there. He did briefly reunite with Douglas, but at this point, Douglas was actually a homophobe, so things did not work out between them, to say the least. He wrote very little during this period, and his only notable piece of work was the Ballad of Reading Gaol, which talked about his experience in prison and an execution that he witnessed while being there. He died of meningitis on November 30th, 1900, at the age of 46. He is still remembered for his personality, his wit, and also his imprisonment for being gay. He stuck to his principles of aestheticism and repopularized the style through his lectures and his very own works of literature. Since I started with the quote, I also decided to end with one. So this is actually from the preface to The Pictures of Dorian Gray. Wilde writes, "All art is at once surface and symbol. Those who go beneath the surface do so at their own peril. Those who read the symbol do so at their own peril. It is the spectator, and not life, that art really mirrors. Diversity of opinion about a work of art shows that the work is new, complex, and vital." So I think this quote really sums up what Oscar stood for and kind of the meaning of his life that was rocky towards the end, but also very influential to literature and to the aestheticism movement.